Kate Vale was 23 and a widow for 2 weeks. The Wyoming wind that scoured her husband's failed claim was about to deliver a man who believed a pretty thing like her was a debt that could be collected. She would be cornered at her own well, her solitude mistaken for weakness, her grief for opportunity. What the man with the grinning mouth and the easy swagger didn't know was that a neighbor was watching from the cool dark of a barn. A quiet, steady man named Ward Haskell, who had already decided that this was not the way her story was going to end. The rifle in his hands was loaded, but the life he was about to offer was built of quieter things, a warm room, a kept supper, and a safety she had stopped believing she could ever know again. Stay close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The man's name was Cole. He was one of the 3 cattle hands Frank had owed money to, a debt left unsettled by the fever that had taken her husband in 3 short days. She had seen him in town once, leaning against the saloon post, his eyes lingering. Now, he was here. He'd ridden up quiet, leaving his horse to graze on the thin patch of grass near the creek, and walked toward the cabin as if he had a right to be there. Kate was at the well, the bucket rope course in her hands. She had heard the hoofbeats, but had hoped it was just a stray, or maybe Mr. Haskell riding his fence line. The hope died when Cole's shadow fell over her. "Well now," he said, his voice a low, confident drawl. "Look what we have here." Kate didn't turn. She kept her grip on the rope, her knuckles white. She could feel his presence behind her, too close, smelling of sweat, dust, and cheap whiskey. "I'm busy," she said, her own voice flat and small in the vast emptiness of the plains. He chuckled, a sound like gravel rolling downhill. "Sure you are. Busy being all alone out here. A pretty thing like you shouldn't be alone." He moved to her side, blocking her path back to the cabin. His grin was wide, but it didn't touch his eyes. They were flat, assessing. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a horse he's thinking of buying, or taking. "Frank owed us," he said, his tone shifting from false charm to something harder. "Left a considerable tab. But I told the boys maybe we could work something else out, an arrangement." Kate finally looked at him. She kept her face still, a mask she had perfected long before she'd come to Wyoming. She let her eyes meet his and held them. "There is no arrangement," she said. "The claim is all that's left. You can have it." Cole laughed outright this time. "The claim ain't worth the sweat it took to file it, and you know it." "No, I was thinking of something more neighborly." He reached out, his hand closing around her upper arm. His grip was not brutal, but it was firm. A statement. "That's why I keep the rifle loaded." The voice came from the barn. It was not loud, but it cut through the air, sharp and cold as a winter morning. Cole's hand dropped from her arm as if it had been burned. He turned, his grin gone, replaced by a sullen watchfulness. Ward Haskell stood in the shadowed opening of Kate's dilapidated barn, a Winchester rifle held easy in his hands, its barrel pointed at the ground, but its meaning unmistakable. He wasn't a large man, not in the way Cole was, but he stood with a stillness that took up more space than muscle ever could. He had been mending the broken hinge on her barn door, a task he'd undertaken without a word to her. One of a dozen small fixes he'd made in the 2 weeks since Frank's burial. He hadn't said he was coming over. He just appeared, saw a thing that was broken, and set about making it right. Now he took a slow step forward, the sunlight catching the worn stock of the rifle. He looked from Cole to Kate, his gaze resting on her for a fraction of a second, taking in the straight line of her back, the way her hands were balled into fists at her sides. He read the entire situation in that one glance. The trespass, the threat, the woman who would not break. His eyes, a pale, quiet gray, shifted back to Cole. "Her husband's debt is with the claim," Ward said, his voice as calm as before. "You take it up with the land, not with her." Cole's bravado tried to reassert itself. He hitched his pants and spat on the ground. This ain't your business, Haskell. This is between me and the widow. Ward took another step, closing half the distance between them. The rifle didn't move, but the air around it seemed to grow heavy. I'm making it my business, he said. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, plain and unadorned. She's not unprotected. The words hung in the silence. Cole looked at the set of Ward's jaw, at the rifle that was so much a part of him it looked like an extension of his arm, and then at Kate's unyielding face. He saw he was not dealing with a lone woman, but with something else, something he hadn't accounted for. Some unspoken alliance. With a low curse, he turned on his heel, strode to his horse, and swung into the saddle. He gave Kate one last, venomous look. This ain't over, he snarled, before spurring his horse into a gallop, kicking up dust and resentment. Ward watched him go, his posture unchanged, until the rider was a small speck disappearing over the ridge. Only then did he lower the rifle, breaking it open to check the chamber out of habit. He walked over to the well, his steps measured and quiet. He stopped a few feet from Kate, not crowding her. He won't be the last, he said, his voice losing its hard edge, returning to its usual quiet timbre. He looked at her small, isolated cabin, the peeling paint, the fence that was more gaps than posts. He looked at her. You can't stay out here alone. Kate watched him, her heart still hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She had been holding her breath, and now she let it out in a slow, shaky exhale. She expected him to say more, to offer platitudes, or ask if she was all right. He did neither. He simply stated the truth as he saw it, his gaze direct and serious. It was this plainness that undid her more than Cole's menace. She had been prepared for a fight. She was not prepared for quiet, practical concern. I have nowhere else to go, she said, the words stark. It was the simplest, hardest truth of her life. Her family was back east, a world away, and her pride was a wall she would not let them see her crumble against. Ward nodded, as if he'd already considered this. He leaned the rifle against the stone wall of the well and picked up the bucket rope she had dropped. With a few efficient turns, he drew up a full bucket of water, the mechanism groaning in protest. He set it on the edge of the well for her. I have a spare room, he said, looking not at her, but toward the horizon where his own ranch lay, 2 miles to the east. My wife's sister used it before she married and moved on. It has its own door to the porch. He paused, then finally met her eyes. You could help with the house. My Sarah, she's only 7, she tries, but a child can't run a home. My boy Ben, he's 10. He helps me with the ranch work. It's a lot for them. He wasn't asking. He was laying out a set of facts, a solution to a problem. The offer was as unadorned as the man himself. Shelter and purpose, nothing more. No pity, no charity. A transaction. Room and board, he continued, until you sort what's next. Until those men lose interest and move on. Kate took in his proposal, turning it over in her mind. She looked at his work-roughened hands, the worn collar of his shirt, the exhaustion that sat deep in the lines around his eyes. He was a man with his own burdens, a widower, like her a widow. He was not offering help out of gallantry. He was offering a practical arrangement that served them both. He needed a housekeeper. She needed a safe harbor. Still, a coil of suspicion, tight and familiar, hardened in her gut. She had learned early, and often, that men who offered help to a woman like her usually expected a payment that was never spoken aloud. She had come to Wyoming as Frank's wife, believing in a future that had turned to dust, and she would not be anyone's dependent again. I pay my way, Mr. Haskell, she said, her voice firm, stripped of the earlier tremor. I will cook and clean and mend for you and your children. I am a hard worker. But it will be an arrangement for wages, room and board, and $1 a week. So we are clear. It was a pittance, but it was not nothing. It was the line between being a guest and being an employee, between being taken in and holding her own. Ward considered her for a long moment. A flicker of something, surprise, or maybe respect, passed through his eyes. "Fine," he said with a single, decisive nod. $1 a week. "I'll bring the wagon around in the morning. Pack what you need." He picked up his rifle, gave another nod that was both a greeting and a farewell, and started the walk back to his own property, leaving her standing by the well with the bucket of clear, cold water and the first real choice she'd had in months. The next morning, the sun was barely a pale wash in the eastern sky when Ward Haskell's wagon appeared, a dark shape moving steadily through the low-lying mist. He did not come to the cabin door. He simply pulled the team to a halt and waited, a silent, patient figure on the driver's seat. Kate was ready. She had spent the night packing, her movements economical and precise. She did not own much. A single trunk held her clothes and linens. A small crate contained her kitchen essentials, a cast-iron skillet, a few plates, and the silver-backed hairbrush that had been her mother's. Her last, most precious possession she carried by hand, a small, dark wood sewing basket with a tarnished brass latch. Inside, nestled among spools of practical brown and black thread, was a bundle of fine Irish linen and skeins of silk floss in soft blues and creams, saved for a life of gentle, decorative things she had long ago stopped imagining for herself. She had not cried. She had simply moved through the small, dusty cabin, touching the rough-hewn furniture Frank had made, saying a silent goodbye not to the man, but to the dream he had represented. She locked the door behind her, the sound of the key turning in the lock a final, metallic punctuation mark. As she walked toward the wagon, she saw that Ward had already loaded the broken lengths of her fence posts into the back. He was salvaging what he could. Nothing was wasted. He hopped down as she approached and took the trunk from her without a word, lifting it into the wagon bed as if it weighed nothing. He saw the sewing basket in her hand, but made no move to take it. He seemed to understand it was not a thing to be handled by others. "That's everything?" he asked. She nodded. "Everything that matters." He helped her up onto the seat, his hand firm and impersonal at her elbow, and then climbed up beside her. They rode in silence for the first mile, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft jingle of the harness. His ranch came into view slowly, a collection of solid, well-kept buildings nestled in a shallow valley carved by a creek. Unlike her derelict claim, this place spoke of permanence and care. The fences were straight and true, the barn was freshly painted a deep, sensible red, and the house, though simple, was sturdy, with a wide porch and smoke curling from its stone chimney. As they pulled into the yard, 2 children appeared on the porch, a boy and a girl, their faces etched with a solemn curiosity. The girl, small and blonde, clutched a corn-husk doll. The boy, dark-haired and lean like his father, stood with his arms crossed, his expression wary. "Ben, Sarah," Ward said as he drew the wagon to a stop. "This is Mrs. Vale. She'll be staying with us for a while, helping out." The girl, Sarah, gave a shy half-smile. The boy, Ben, just stared, his eyes missing nothing. Kate met his gaze directly, without smiling, simply acknowledging him. She knew a child's trust was a thing to be earned, not coaxed. Ward led her to the spare room. It was at the back of the house, clean and spare, smelling of cedar and lye soap. A simple cot was made up with a thick wool blanket. There was a small table, a chair, and a row of pegs on the wall. As promised, a door led directly out onto the back porch, offering a measure of independence. In the main room, a fire crackled in the hearth, but the space felt held. A rocking chair sat near the fire, its wood polished by use, but a fine layer of dust lay upon it. No one sat there. It was a space someone had left, a silence the rest of the house had agreed not to disturb. Kate set her sewing basket down on the small table in her room, the careful click of the wood on wood the only sound she made. She had arrived. The arrangement had begun. The first days fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm, a routine built from tasks and silence. Kate rose before dawn, the habit of a lifetime. The first morning, she entered the kitchen to find Ward already there, a tin mug of coffee in his hand as he stared out the window at the coming light. He had built up the fire in the cookstove. He simply nodded at her and pushed a second mug across the rough-hewn table. He left it black, the way he took his. He did not ask if she wanted it or how she liked it. He just provided it. It was a gesture of inclusion, not hospitality, and she understood the difference. She drank it, and the next morning the coffee was already brewing on the stove when he came in from the barn. They did not speak of it. The house was a man's house, orderly in its tools and outdoor things, but chaotic inside. Dishes were clean, but stacked precariously. The pantry was a jumble of tins and sacks. Kate began to impose a quiet order. She did not throw anything away or rearrange Ward's personal effects. She simply made things right. She organized the pantry, labeling flour and sugar sacks with neat tags. She scrubbed the floors until the pine boards shone. She found a rhythm for the laundry, for the baking, for the mending. Each evening, she held supper warm. Ward and Ben often came in late, long after dark, smelling of horses and cold air. The first night, he'd entered the kitchen looking resigned to a cold meal. Instead, he found a plate of beef stew and biscuits waiting on the back of the stove, kept hot with a second plate inverted over it. Sarah was already asleep, but Kate had waited up. Ward stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. He looked at the waiting plate, then at her. He said nothing but, obliged, before sitting down to eat. After that, a plate was always waiting. The mending was a constant. Ben, in particular, was hard on his clothes, a boy made of scraped knees and torn elbows. One evening, Kate took up one of his shirts, the sleeve nearly ripped from its seam. She retrieved her sewing basket, taking out a spool of sturdy brown thread. Her fingers, nimble and sure, went to work. The stitches were small, even, and almost invisible, a line of perfect reinforcement. Ben watched her from across the table, his usual guarded expression softening with a flicker of interest. When she was done, she handed it back to him. He took it, running his thumb over the seam. It was stronger than it had been when it was new. He didn't say thank you, but the next day, he left a small, perfect hawk's feather on the porch rail outside her door. Ward, too, continued his silent contributions. The back porch step, which had a dangerous wobble, was suddenly firm and solid one afternoon. The axe by the woodpile, which had been dull, now bit into the wood with a clean, sharp thirst. These were the conversations they had, a language of fixed hinges and warm stew, of mended shirts and coffee left on the counter. Neither of them named what was forming between the four walls of the house. It was a partnership, built of competence and mutual respect. It was the quiet, steady work of building a life, even if they both believed it was only temporary. The children were the first to let the new reality settle in. Sarah, with the open heart of a 7-year-old starved for a woman's softness, attached herself to Kate immediately. She followed her through the house, a small, chattering shadow, handing her clothespins, trying to help sweep with a broom too big for her, and peppering her with endless questions. "Can you make braids?" Mama used to make braids. Kate, whose own hair was always pinned in a severe, practical knot, paused one afternoon, took the ribbon from Sarah's tangled blonde hair, and gently began to comb. Her fingers were surprisingly deft, and soon a neat, tight braid hung down the little girl's back. Sarah touched it with a sense of wonder. From then on, the morning braiding became a ritual, a quiet moment of tenderness that anchored the start of each day. It was through Sarah that Kate learned the geography of the family's grief. The dusty rocking chair belonged to her mother, Clara. "Papa doesn't like anyone to sit in it," Sarah explained one day in a whisper, as if sharing a great secret. Kate had already understood. It was an altar, and she was careful not to trespass. Ben was a harder case. He held himself apart, his loyalty to his father and the memory of his mother a shield against the interloper in their kitchen. He watched Kate with a critical eye, testing her. He'd ask questions about ranching he already knew the answers to, seeing if she'd pretend to knowledge she didn't have. "You know how to gut a fish?" he asked one afternoon, dropping 2 freshly caught trout on the back step. "No," Kate answered plainly, without apology. "But I expect you could show me." The directness disarmed him. He hesitated, then with a grudging sigh, he knelt and showed her, his small hands expertly demonstrating the quick, clean cuts. She learned, and the next time he brought fish, she cleaned them herself. The work done neatly. His approval was a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The turning point came a week later. A horse in the north pasture had gotten tangled in a length of old wire and had a deep, nasty gash on its leg. Ward was working to free it when Ben came running to the house, his face pale with panic. "Mrs. Vale, Papa needs you." Kate didn't hesitate. She grabbed her sewing basket, not for the fine silks, but for the sharpest needles and clean linen cloths she kept at the bottom, and ran with him. She knelt in the dirt beside Ward, her skirt forgotten, and calmly assessed the wound. "Hold him steady," she said, her voice low and sure. She cleaned the cut with a deftness that surprised Ward, then stitched the flesh together with tight, clean sutures, her hands moving with the same precision she used on torn fabric. That evening, as she served supper, Ben looked across the table at her. "Thank you for helping with the horse, ma'am," he said quietly. Later, when she was putting Sarah to bed, the little girl wrapped her arms around Kate's neck. "Good night, Mama," she whispered, her voice sleepy. The word landed in the quiet room with the weight of a stone. Kate went still, her breath catching in her throat. She gently detached the child's arms and tucked her in, her face unreadable. But when she went back to the main room, she saw Ward standing in the shadows of the hallway. He had heard. He said nothing, his face giving no sign, but something in the room had changed, and they both knew it. The small acts of care intensified after that, becoming less about shared work and more about a shared life. The unspoken arrangement began to fray at the edges, revealing something warmer and more fragile beneath. One night, a late autumn storm blew in, a furious assault of wind and freezing rain. Kate had been up late, mending a tear in one of Ward's heavy canvas coats by the fire. The rhythmic pull of the needle, the warmth of the hearth, and the relentless drumming of the rain on the roof conspired to lull her into a deep exhaustion she rarely allowed herself to feel. Her head drooped, and before she knew it, she was asleep in the chair, her cheek resting against the rough wool of the coat. She woke with a start hours later, in the deep, silent dark before dawn. The fire had been built back up, casting a warm, steady glow. A thick wool blanket was tucked carefully around her shoulders. The mending lay folded on the table beside her, and her sewing basket was closed, the latch secured. Ward was gone, already out to the barn for the morning milking. He had been there. He had found her asleep, vulnerable, and instead of waking her, he had made her comfortable. He had covered her. The gesture was so profoundly gentle, so deeply considerate, it left her feeling more exposed than if he had shaken her awake. She folded the blanket, her hands trembling slightly, and placed it back on the chest where it belonged. The house was quiet, holding its breath. Later that week, as she was kneading dough for the day's bread, her hands dusted with flour, Ward came into the kitchen for his morning coffee. He didn't take the mug and leave as he usually did. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her work for a long moment. The silence between them was different now, charged with the things they did not say. "Where did you learn to stitch like that?" he asked, his voice low. It was the first time he had asked her a question about herself, about her past, about a skill that was uniquely hers. It wasn't about her dead husband, or the drifters, or her usefulness in his house. It was about her. The question caught her off guard. She stopped kneading, her hands still in the dough. "My mother taught me," she said, her voice quiet. She was a seamstress. She believed a fine stitch was a mark of a good character. He nodded slowly, his eyes holding hers. "She was right," he said. He took his coffee and left, but the kitchen felt smaller, the space between them filled with a new intimacy. That night, when he came in from the cold, he brought her something. He laid a small, intricately carved wooden bird on the table beside her mending basket. It was whittled from a piece of cottonwood, its wings detailed with delicate knife-work. "Ben made it," he said, not looking at her. "He wanted you to have it." Kate picked up the bird, its smooth, cool wood a comfort in her palm. It was a gift, a sign of acceptance from the boy, delivered by the father. It was clear. This was no longer just an arrangement. This was a home, and she was a part of it, and the knowledge was both a comfort and a terror. The warmth that had been building in the Haskell house was a fragile thing, easily chilled. The first frost of social disapproval arrived on a Saturday, carried into town in the back of Ward's wagon. Kate had come with him to the general store for supplies, the first time she'd been to town since her arrival. She was standing by the counter, going over her list with Sarah at her side, when Martha Gable, the store owner's wife, approached Mrs. Gable was a woman whose pronouncements were delivered with the force of Scripture, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Catherine," she said, her tone thick with a syrupy concern that didn't quite mask its judgment. "It's good to see you looking so settled." She glanced pointedly at Ward, who was hefting a sack of flour nearby. "Mr. Haskell is a good man, a good Christian man. It's a mercy he took you in. A woman in your position must be so careful about appearances." The implication was as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. Kate felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the cold wash of shame. The friendly chatter in the store died down as people turned to listen. She was once again a spectacle. A widow of questionable circumstance, living in a man's house. She did not defend herself. Her silence was a deep and painful habit, a shield she raised against a world that was always ready to find her wanting. She simply met Mrs. Gable's gaze, her face a polite, unreadable mask, and said, "Mr. Haskell has been very kind." Ward finished loading the flour and straightened up. He had heard every word. He walked over, placing a hand gently on Sarah's shoulder, positioning himself at Kate's side. He looked at Mrs. Gable, his expression calm, but his eyes were hard as granite. "Kate is my housekeeper," he said, his voice quiet but firm, reaching the listening ears as effectively as Mrs. Gable's had. "And my friend. Her position is with my family." He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply stated her value, redefined her position, and stood by her. The simple, public act of solidarity was more powerful than any defense she could have mounted. But the damage was done. On the ride home, the easy silence between them was replaced by a strained quiet. Kate sat ramrod straight, staring at the horizon, the carved bird in her pocket feeling heavy and foolish. She had allowed herself to forget what she was, a temporary fixture, a subject of gossip. That night, she served supper and then retreated to her room, closing the door between them for the first time. The talk in town was amplified a few days later. Cole, the drifter, had been in the saloon, drinking and talking. The rumor he was spreading was ugly, that Kate had been more than just Frank's wife, that her husband's debts were of a more personal nature, and that she had a history of leaving trouble in her wake. The warmth that had been building around her in the community pulled back like water before a frost. She felt the chill in the averted eyes, the sudden silences when she entered a room. She withdrew further into herself, her work in the house becoming her only refuge. She was useful, and that, she knew, was not the same as being wanted. The rumors festered, a low-grade infection in the town's bloodstream. Kate felt the change in every small interaction, every glance that lingered a moment too long. She kept to the ranch, pouring her anxiety into her work, scrubbing floors that were already clean, baking bread they couldn't possibly eat. She was building a fortress of usefulness around herself, but she knew it was a temporary defense. The threat, she sensed, was not gone. It was just gathering its strength. It came to a head on a bright, cold afternoon, a month after the incident at the general store. Ward had needed a particular part for the plow, and had ridden into town, taking Ben with him. Kate was alone with Sarah, hanging laundry on the line. The crisp autumn air bit at her cheeks, and the clean scent of lye soap and sun-dried cotton was a small, wholesome comfort. That comfort was shattered by the sound of an approaching horse. It was Cole. He didn't ride into the yard this time. He dismounted at the gate and walked toward her, his stride carrying the same arrogant swagger as before. But this time, his grin was gone. His face was set in a look of grim purpose. He was holding a folded piece of paper in his hand. "We need to talk," he said, stopping a few feet from her. Sarah, sensing the menace in his voice, scurried behind Kate's skirts, clutching a handful of her dress. "There's nothing to talk about," Kate said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. She put a protective hand on Sarah's head. "You need to leave." "Not this time," Cole said, holding up the paper like a deed. "This is the note for the money Frank owed. It's been signed over to me. All of it. The debt is mine now." And so, he took a deliberate step closer, his eyes dropping to her in a possessive, insulting way. "Are his assets." The word landed like a slap. Assets, he was claiming her like a piece of property. A chattel to be seized for payment. He was doing it here, in her sanctuary, in front of the child she had come to love. This time, she was not just still. A cold, pure anger rose in her, an emotion so fierce it burned away the fear. "I am not an asset, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "And you will not speak to me that way in this house. Get out." "I ain't going anywhere," he snarled, lunging forward and grabbing her arm. "You're coming with me. We'll settle this once and for all. Let go of her." The voice was Ward's. He was there, at the edge of the yard, having returned earlier than expected. Ben was beside him, his young face a mask of fury. Ward wasn't holding a rifle this time. He didn't need one. His presence was enough. He walked forward, his steps unhurried, his eyes locked on Cole's hand on Kate's arm. He did not stop until he was standing directly in front of them. He looked at Cole. "I said, let go." Cole, faced with Ward's unmovable calm, slowly released his grip. He brandished the paper again. "She's mine to settle with, Haskell. I got the paper." Ward didn't even glance at it. He reached into his coat, pulled out a worn leather wallet, and extracted a roll of bills. He counted out a sum, more than Frank could have possibly owed, and held it out to Cole. "Here is the money," he said, his voice flat. "The debt is paid. Now get off my land and don't ever come back." Cole stared at the cash, then at Ward's face, and knew he was beaten. He snatched the money, his greed overriding his pride. Without another word, he turned and stalked away. Ward watched him go, then turned to Kate. The whole town, it seemed, had been watching from a distance, but now he only had eyes for her. In the sudden, ringing silence, in front of his son, he spoke to her, his voice low and earnest. "Kate, don't go back to your room. Don't go anywhere." He took a breath. "I'm asking you to stay. For good, as my wife." The proposal hung in the cold, clear air, as plain and solid as the man who had spoken it. It was not a question born of crisis or convenience. It was a statement, offered quietly in the aftermath of a storm. A claiming that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with belonging. Kate stared at him, the world narrowing to his steady gray eyes. He wasn't looking at her as an asset, or a housekeeper, or a problem to be solved. He was looking at her, Kate Vale, a woman he had chosen to stand beside in front of the world. He had paid off a debt that wasn't his, and then offered her a future that could be. He gave her the space to answer, his gaze unwavering, patient. He was not a man who would rush her. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind in the laundry on the line. Sarah peeked out from behind her skirts, her small face anxious. Ben stood beside his father, his young shoulders squared, waiting. Kate thought of the cold, empty cabin on the claim, of the years spent making herself useful to feel safe, of the constant, wearying vigilance. Then she thought of coffee left on a counter, of a mended porch step, of a blanket tucked around her in the night. She thought of a little girl's braid, a boy's carved bird, and a man who spoke in a language of quiet, reliable care. A slow, tentative warmth spread through her chest, melting the knot of fear that had lived there for so long. She was being given a choice, and for the first time she knew what it felt like to choose towards something, instead of just away from it. Yes, she said. The word was barely a whisper, but it was absolute. Yes, Ward. A slow smile touched Ward's mouth, a rare sight that transformed his serious face. Ben let out a breath he'd been holding, a grin of his own breaking free. Sarah launched herself from behind Kate and threw her arms around both their legs, a small, triumphant shriek escaping her. The wedding was 3 days later, on the steps of the small clapboard church in town. It was a simple ceremony, officiated by the circuit preacher. They had expected only a few witnesses, but the church steps were crowded. The town, having heard the story of Cole's dismissal and Ward's public proposal, had turned out. It was their quiet, collective apology, a silent acknowledgement of their judgment and a welcome into the fold. Mrs. Gable was there, standing at the back, her expression unreadable but her presence a concession. Kate wore her best dress, a simple dark blue wool, and in her hands she carried not flowers, but a single, perfect hawk's feather Ben had given her that morning. Ward stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a solid, comforting presence. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, he did not kiss her in front of the crowd. He simply leaned in and said, low enough for only her to hear, "Welcome home, Kate." They walked back to the wagon through a sea of quiet, nodding faces. He helped her onto the seat, and as he climbed up beside her, their hands met in the space between them. His fingers laced through hers, a firm, warm promise. She was no longer a widow on a lonely claim, or a housekeeper living on borrowed time. She was Kate Haskell. She was home. The seasons turned. Winter came, blanketing the Wyoming landscape in a deep, cleansing snow. The Haskell Ranch was an island of warmth and light in the vast whiteness. The rhythm of their lives settled into a new, deeper harmony. The quiet acts of care continued, but now they were layered with an easy intimacy. A shared glance across the supper table, a hand on a shoulder in passing, the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other without the need for words. The house itself seemed to exhale, letting go of its held breath. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, Kate was sitting by the fire, reading to Sarah. She was in the rocking chair. She hadn't decided to sit there. She had simply sunk into it after a long day. The motion as natural as breathing. Ward came in from the barn, stamping snow from his boots. He stopped and looked at her, a soft expression on his face. The chair, once a memorial to a life that was over, was now part of a life that was beginning. It was no longer an untouched object. It was just a chair, filled with the warmth of his wife. Kate's sewing basket now sat open on the hearth, its contents no longer hidden. The fine linen and colored silks were intermingled with the practical threads. She had used the soft blue floss to embroider a small flower on the collar of one of Sarah's dresses. She had used the linen to patch one of Ben's good shirts, the fine white square a mark of care, not poverty. She was no longer saving her best things for a life she might have someday. She was using them for this life, for this family. The gossip in town had fallen silent. Kate was no longer the subject of speculation. She was Ward Haskell's wife, a woman known for her skill, her quiet strength, and the fierce love she had for her husband and children. One afternoon, Mrs. Gable came to the ranch, her own child sick with a fever. She asked for Kate's help, her pride finally bowing to need. Kate tended to the child with her usual calm competence, and when Mrs. Gable left, she pressed a jar of her best preserves into Kate's hands. No apology was spoken, but it was understood. The rifle still hung on the wall, but its presence had changed. It was no longer a symbol of the danger lurking just outside the door. It was a tool, like the axe or the plow, part of the fabric of a life wrested from a hard land. The true protection, Kate knew, was not in the loaded gun, but in the man who came in from the cold each night, in the children who called her mama, and in the quiet, steady beating of a heart that had finally, completely, stopped being afraid. She had arrived in Wyoming with nothing but a bag and a spine, and had found everything that mattered. The house held its warmth, no longer waiting for anyone. It was full.